Okay, there we go. Wonderful. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you today. So my name is Cathrin Bauer Bulst. I'm the head of unit for security in the digital age at the European Commission in Brussels. And the task of my unit is to devise policy and to propose legislation to prevent and combat cybercrimes and to support investigations into cyber-enabled crimes. And I very much welcome the opportunity to participate here. And actually, as I was preparing for this, I got a call from my parents yesterday who fell victim to a scam yesterday. It seemed a bit of something I had brought on to them by preparing for this. I almost felt. Luckily, they only fell for it for a few minutes. But just to share with you, it's a scam that's very typical in Germany today, where my parents live. Somebody calls, an indistinct woman's voice says, I had a terrible accident. And then it moves on to police and prosecutors who say that in this case, my sister had caused a significant accident, had killed someone in the process and had also suffered internal injuries, and that it was necessary to pay very quickly so that she would not need to go to jail and instead could be brought to a hospital to be assessed for her injuries. And my parents are extremely well educated, very smart people who read the news every day, who were very well aware of these kinds of scams. And nonetheless, they also went through the initial 5 minutes of complete shock, which, as my dad told me, really prevented him from even engaging rationally with the situation at hand. And I spoke to them several hours after. They discontinued the conversation, luckily after a few minutes, when they realized that this couldn't possibly be true. And in a very lucky coincidence, my sister happened to text them as they were on the phone with the scammers. But my parents, of course, are also elderly, and the psychological impact just of these few minutes of complete shock really had a significant impact. And I just want to reiterate what was already shared by many of you yesterday and also in the video now. The extreme human toll this also takes beyond the significant financial damage. I am originally from Germany. This is where my parents now live. And Germany, of course, is a country that is characterized by a significant amount of wealthy people of advanced age who have become a prime target for these kinds of scams. And today I now want to spend a few more minutes talking about the problem as we see it across the EU, not just in Germany, and some of the solutions we are working on from the European Commission perspective. So first of all, there are also some good news that I would like to start with. You may be well aware of the Payment Services Directive in Europe, which has been revised recently and which has put a significant damper on a kind of fraud that we still saw as being very prevalent just a few years ago, the so-called card not present fraud. This used to be a significant problem in terms of the level of fraud that e-merchants saw in particular. Back in 2019, there was a total value in the EU of fraud that amounted to 1.87 billion, according to the European Central Bank statistics. And in 2019, 80% of this fraud still resulted from card not present fraud. Now, if you fast forward to today, we are not seeing this fraud anymore with the additional security features that were introduced through the Payment Services Directive. And that has even led Europol to discontinue its activities targeting the card not present fraud that it used to run. So here we have some good news, but what that means is simply that fraud has now moved on to other approaches. It has moved to more targeted, more sophisticated types of frauds in Europe, from high volume, low individual harm types of frauds to very specific scams with very high payoffs, like in the case that George presented in the video. And in fact, investment fraud is the area where across the EU, we're seeing the most significant rise in cases. It usually takes the same kinds of forms as described in the video. There are perpetrators offering various forms of easy earnings, encouraging potential victims to invest in various assets, crypto, virtual currencies, products, gold, funds, etc., with promises of unrealistically high returns. And just to give you a recent example from our European police agency, Europol, just last month on the 6th of October, the Spanish police was able to arrest a prolific scammer in Tenerife as a result of a complex investigation that brought together the German, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Hungarian authorities. The suspect was in fact a Croatian national who ran a large-scale pyramid scheme which earned at least 5 million out of unsuspecting investors, and those are probably conservative estimates. Over 70 German victims have been identified so far, and it's a very typical way of proceeding. The criminal posed as a representative of a legitimate investment firm and had created a complete website to support his activities with a very legitimate looking portfolio of products and offerings, and had basically created a domain that was nearly identical to that of a real investment company. And he had fabricated lots of documentation to support the creation of confidence of his investors. Europol sees this also in much more sophisticated versions, including web platforms that allow victims to log in and verify progress of their investment, so supposed earnings on the money invested in their so-called account over time. And then after a few months, these platforms disappear. In a recent case that involved Latvia and Lithuania, the scam was so well created with hundreds of employees that even some employees were not aware that they were working for an entirely criminal enterprise, which at the time generated a monthly turnover of around 3 million euros and even had its own HR, IT, and logistics department. So it was really a very sophisticated setup. And law enforcement tell Europol that these call centers are growing like mushrooms, and they very cunningly exploit the weakness of law enforcement's traditionally national setup. You can now easily reach everyone around the world via the phone and the internet, but law enforcement can only follow you to the border. So call centers, as a rule, have now avoided ever approaching anyone in the jurisdiction that they're set up in, so that they don't attract law enforcement attention at home and basically benefit from the additional hurdles that law enforcement in the country where the victims are located face in reaching out across borders. We've also seen a lot of romance scam recently, and of course, a significant rise in business email compromise, and especially CEO fraud type schemes, which once again exploit situations of urgency, creating a sense of urgency that through the stress it creates in the recipient often does not enable people to fully verify the claims that are being made, and then facilitates the swift transfer of funds into illegitimate schemes. And of course, we're still seeing a lot of e-commerce fraud in all versions, with sellers purporting to have shipped certain goods that are never delivered after the payment has already been made, or the reverse, that buyers are asking sellers to ship things and then pretend to have paid but never do so. And we've also finally, in terms of examples for the EU, have seen a rise in law enforcement fraud, I would call it. So the type of fraud that my parents were just exposed to, where somebody purports to have been either a victim of crime or is accused of a crime, and then there needs to be a payment made to quickly release the family member from custody, or also something I personally have already received several times, accusations that Europol in this case had found on my computer evidence of child pornography, and that there was a procedure ongoing and I needed to quickly pay fines to make sure it didn't go any further. So we see a lot of this across the EU. And of course, the red thread across all of these types of highly targeted scams with usually high payoffs is social engineering. So we're exploiting now the weakness of the victims in a direct response to the fact that the dike, as George called it earlier, against the tidal wave of scam has already been raised on other fronts, the scammers have now adapted to the weakest element in the chain, which of course is the victim, him or herself. So what can we do to tame this Wild West? To start responding to George's question for this panel, what can we do at the EU level and what have we done? From our perspective, there are three aspects that we can tackle. First of all of the scammers need communication tools, such as the phone, the internet, the web platforms that were already cited. That is one aspect where we can raise the dike from the EU perspective. Secondly, at some point, money needs to transfer hands. And of course, following the money and increasing prevention on the financial sector side are two things that we can do. And third, of course, perhaps most importantly, we need to raise awareness and educate the victims. So in terms of solutions at EU level, what we have invested a lot in fact, is this third point of awareness raising, which has a huge role to play that all of regulation cannot replace. And I know that all of you here today contribute to this: law enforcement, consumer protection agencies, banks, the media. All of us need to raise awareness. And just by way of example, I want to cite the efforts that Europol, the European Law Enforcement Agency, has invested. Just to cite one example, during the COVID pandemic, when there was a lot of vaccine and medication scamming going on, Europol was one of the first in Europe to put forward first of all, a source of reliable information on vaccines and medication. And then secondly, also a characterization of typical types of scams and how to recognize them in all of the EU languages, so that consumers had a trusted source that would help them identify what were credible offerings and distinguish them from the many scams that were happening at the time. And this is something that they have continued on all fronts of online fraud. Then we also need to put pressure on the system. And here the joint Europol investigations have been extremely helpful. We have a specific priority across the EU law enforcement agencies in all the member states on online fraud schemes more generally, and specifically on online investment fraud. And there have been a number of cases that have been generated. But there are also areas where prevention and awareness raising and investigations alone, of course, are not sufficient, and where regulation has proven useful already. First of all, there's four areas that I'd like to mention here. First of all, payment services regulation, as I already mentioned in the beginning, plays a very significant role here. PSD2, I've already mentioned. We're working on another revision of the Payment Services Directive, and have just made a proposal also on instant payments that includes the possibility for automatic IBAN verification, so that you avoid the fraud schemes where simply you exchange the bank account number and you leave the same recipient name. That should help address some of the types of CEO fraud, for example, that we're seeing, and other social engineering fraud. We have also started putting some order into the crypto Wild West with the recent agreement of the so-called MiCA rules, the markets and crypto assets rules, which are some basic rules for crypto marketplaces that help the crypto world to have more of a framework akin to our standard banking system, and that at once liberates a new market space for crypto assets. So it should actually have a positive impact on the crypto world, but it also allows us to introduce some basic security features, and this may be followed by more specific proposals. Secondly, we can also enhance prevention via measures that tackle the communication tools themselves, such as the hijacked or maliciously created websites that scammers use to lend legitimacy to their schemes. And this means in particular countering abuse of the DNS. This is something that we've actively been working on, and as we will hear in one of the next interventions from one of the authors of the recent DNS abuse study that the Commission has financed, I'll come back to that afterwards in the discussion. The third point I would like to mention is the law enforcement side of things. We need criminalization and cooperation. As we've heard all across these 1.5 days, fraudsters rarely act in just one jurisdiction. think back to the initial examples here with the businessman traveling to Dubai. We have harmonized for this purpose the rules across the EU for cybercrimes. So law enforcement now speak one language on crime, on all of serious and organized crime happening in Europe. And that is a really big support in law enforcement cooperation. And in addition, we have Europol, which supports common investigations and helps coordinate and tie together investigations that relate to the same fraud schemes. We have also, since a couple of years ago, a standing task force at Europol on cybercrimes, which cooperates on an ongoing basis, regardless of individual cases, and can help prioritize and identify which cases to follow and where to lead investigations, which has proven extremely useful in creating a more effective response to frauds. And then finally, we still need to work on swift investigations. And one of the biggest obstacles that we face is the geographic limitation of law enforcement. We have made a proposal already a couple of years back to facilitate cross-border access to electronic evidence, meaning that the judiciary in one country should be able to request information from, for example, an online service provider, even if that service provider is not physically located in the same jurisdiction, but offers its services there. And that, of course, will help us put law enforcement at a speed that is more apt to tackle online crimes. Today, for this, we use mechanisms that are completely outdated for the most part, such as mutual legal assistance, where it can take up to 10 months to get basic information, such as an IP address, if you go through mutual legal assistance. And we're hoping to very much reduce that time frame with the new framework, which should be agreed before the end of this year. So that was my fourth and final point on the EU contribution to global online scam and to finding solutions. These are some good news, but clearly there is still a lot to do. It's an ongoing challenge, and we see that in response to our efforts, scammers move rather than disappear. And I very much look forward to discussing solutions with the other panelists and with you all now on this panel. And thank you very much for your attention.